Welcome to Interface. Today our chief guest is Valerian Rodriguez. He is formerly the professor of Political Science Department, Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Now he is the National Fellow of ICSSR. He is associated with a number of political institutions. He is a public intellectual, and his contributions are largely acknowledged by national and international academic communities. He is working on largely the identity politics, the modern political philosophy, etc. So, we welcome you, sir, to the interface.
Thank you.
So, our discussion is largely surrounding the contemporary political and cultural phenomena of the country. So, one of the important deliberation in the India's Constituent Assembly, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar emphatically, mentioned about there existed a certain kind of conflict between constitutional morality and the social morality. What is the implication of that prophetic statement about the country's, cultural, political, or social predicament?
You must be referring to the concluding speech
of
Baba Sahib Ambedkar at the Constituent Assembly. Baba Sahib Ambedkar worked on the draft of the Constitution very assiduously and very painstakingly for about 3 years. And his intervention in the Constituent Assembly are text to watch to, and because it was very reflective. It actually brought in a great deal of learning, and it was pertinent to the issues concerned. And he felt that through the Constitution, India was establishing a political democracy of great significance, where people across their cleavages and across the great differences that were part of India's national movement were giving to themselves a rule of law which was definitely unprecedented, and it was begetting something called a political democracy that had no precedent earlier. But at the same time, somebody who has fought across caste and caste barriers, particularly against untouchability, and who was deeply aware of the great differences that India came to enfold. He thought that Indian society is driven through and through with great deal of social and economic contradictions. And Ambedkar thought that eventually the viability of political democracy in India depends upon what happens to these contradictions replete in Indian society. Ambedkar had an answer to that. He thought that merely class struggle is not able to overpower some of these great social and economic divide. And he thought that it is important that alongside social inequality, we need to attend to the social and ethnic divide in India. And this task could be performed, according to him, only by a new kind of social conscience begotten through social movements, but also what he termed as constitutional morality. So actually, therefore, he thought political democracy in India rests on a thin soil. Unless that soil begin to get its nurture through a social and economic churning, which begin to incorporate the value of democracy and give it practical shape, he thought political democracy in India is not going to be an engaging exercise for the future.
Okay, that is. Then conversating this argument or this kind of position, you can extend this point of your position towards the understanding of the social justice. For example, the social justice and also the question of the equal opportunity. The country like India having a democratic, inclusive, democratic modern nation state. Indian democracy is actually rested or should be rested on the notions of equality, predominantly in the form of social justice and equal opportunity. Could you reflect upon the
Absolutely, absolutely. At least in Ambedkar's writings, two great values stand out. One is the value of equality, and the other one is the value of justice. And Ambedkar saw them as correlated values. Sometimes he worded them in terms of three values: freedom, equality, and community, and sometimes used the term fraternity. Sometimes in his early writings he traced them to the French Revolution. Later on he begins to say that these values he draws from the teachings of the Buddha.
Yeah, definitely.
But whatever it is, there are some great significances he assigned to these great social virtues. Ambedkar develops a series of very interesting arguments why people need to be treated equally. And these arguments he draws are very different from the kind of familiar arguments that came up in modern Western philosophy, particularly in Kant. Immanuel Kant's work. Now, somebody like Immanuel Kant would say that all men and women are equal because they give purposes to themselves, and their purpose in life or their purposes are not given to them by an external agency, and only men and women give purposes to themselves, and that makes them equal.
Equal, yeah, definitely.
Ambedkar uses a series of very interesting arguments why human beings have to be treated equal. He does not refer to something called the divine spark in human beings, because very often people draw this religious element to say that there is a divine spark in you, there is a divine spark in me, and therefore we are equal. Ambedkar doesn't draw that argument. Ambedkar begins to say that one of his most powerful argument, which actually recurs all the while, is if people are going to be treated on the basis of their birth, what happens to worth?
Worth, definitely.
When we actually begin to talk about worth, we begin to talk about human effort, human skills, and human agency, which becomes productive.
Productive agency.
If humans are going to be treated as equal, Ambedkar would argue that some people are going to be eternally confined to being unequal. And then there is not going to be an effort, because people would say, why should I work? Why should I work hard? Why should I make an endeavor? So there is this powerful argument that is coming from reason rather than attributing to it to a non-reason agency. But he also began to build up this very interesting argument that all right, you begin to say that people are equal on the ground of their, on this ground or that ground. And today a set of people might say that they are equal because they are equal in terms of their merits and talents. But Ambedkar would say merits and talents are historically relative. What is merit and what is demerit undergo change. So if you are going to fix people on the basis of merits and talents, you have permanently fixed people and you are not open to new discoveries and new inventions. And there is a very interesting third argument. He would say that in closed groups, you can always keep, you can begin to say that this person is superior, this person is inferior, because he embodies these capacities, these talents. But when we talk about large societies, which are impersonal societies, they have to be governed by impersonal laws.
Yeah.
Rule of law cannot be reduced to ethnic belonging. So, if you are going to talk about large systems, you need to have a set of laws which can be applicable to all people concerned. So, if you are going to measure the worth of people, then there would be a criterion. But if you are going to use birth by citing belonging, it cannot be a universal criterion. So, what is interesting is the kind of arguments that Ambedkar draws up for equality, and he thinks that liberties is an attribute which is posterior to equality.
Posterior to equality. That is the position on which Ambedkar anchoring his philosophy.
Absolutely, because liberties accrue to you because you are human being, equal human being, and therefore liberties are in a sense posterior to human beings being treated as equal.
Then comes other possibilities for to understanding the nature of the what we call as the graded inequality. A society based on graded inequality where justice is a kind of a problematic issue.
Absolutely.
So, a problematic issue.
Absolutely.
Then for example the institutional structures of the India, for example in pre-colonial India, actually emphasized on the point of the graded inequality on the one hand, and a number of hierarchies, for example the caste and gender hierarchies. In such a situation, how can we conceive the notion of justice and democracy?
One of the arguments that Ambedkar throws up from his first essay, Origin of Caste, written in 1917, is that the principle that informs the caste system is the principle of graded inequality. And across his writings, including his last writings, he holds on that the foundational principle of the caste system is graded inequality. And he begins to argue that graded inequality is very different from any other kind of social inequality that exists in the world.
Definitely.
Because in a graded system, there is a descending attitude of contempt and an ascending order of reverence. So, every rung in this graded hierarchy is going to look down upon the group that is below it and begin to look up to the group above it. The system reproduces itself because no rebellion can actually begin to unite a significant number of people who can challenge this particular kind of gradation, because as soon as you offer challenge, then immediately the next rung begin to enfold that rebellion and begin to see that it is nipped in the bud. So, Ambedkar thought that a social system founded on the principle of graded inequality has a capacity to reproduce itself over time.
Definitely.
Obviously, as you point out, that in this kind of a system, there cannot be social justice, because for Ambedkar, social justice is a system where not merely people are going to be treated as equal, but the worth of people is going to be recognized. How do you get out of this particular kind of system? And Ambedkar here does a complex kind of rethinking about the mode of getting out of that particular kind of system. And now the mode of getting out of the system is pretty complex. Ambedkar thinks that there is something potentially in all human beings that there is a capacity to have a feel of what justice is, a capacity to feel that humans are equal, and therefore although social structures begin to wipe out this particular kind of consciousness and reduce human qualities into natural inequalities, Ambedkar thinks that it cannot be fully vanquished.
Yeah.
And he thinks therefore, given that kind of a potentiality, one can reach out to an alternative system of values and potentialities. Initially he thought that those values and potentialities have been unleashed by the Enlightenment and particularly by the French Revolution. But I feel that eventually Ambedkar feels that such potentiality was unleashed by Buddha's teachings.
Yeah, definitely.
And therefore he begins to reach out to that particular tradition and thinks that it is possible for us to argue out.
Yeah, this conduct, the Ambedkar's dictum, that is the educate, agitate and organize, this is actually morally and ethically actually driven from Buddha's notions of society, people, purpose, etc. and etc. Is it possible to argue that the birth of a modern state, a modern democratic state, is a kind of emancipatory agency?
Yeah. Now, Ambedkar was very affirmative about the modern state.
Yeah.
But the reasons for affirming the state were very different from, say, Hobbesian reasons or the Lockean reasons to affirm the state. Now, let me see it like this. Ambedkar thought that, going back to the point that I was making, that retrieving the teachings of the Buddha is very important for launching an emancipatory project and precipitating a collective and large-scale agency which can actually propose a new set of norms and values for living, for common living. But Ambedkar also was a little critical about the capacity of the certain traditions in India, like the Bhakti traditions, to throw up that kind of an alternative. Therefore, say for example, he did not think that somebody like Ayotita's proposal or the proposal of the saint poet Chokamela were adequate enough for the large-scale emancipatory project of modern times. Not that he was against them, because there are his books, he mentions sometimes people like Tukaram and dedicates the book Shudra to Tukaram, the great Shudra Tukaram. But he thought that these experiments were local experiments, and these local experiments cannot be generalized, number one, and number two, he thought that these experiments put the divine before the secular. They begin to trust in God and in their object of devotion to emancipate, rather than in collective human capacities to emancipate themselves. Because Ambedkar thinks that eventually emancipation is self-emancipation. And it is people realizing their own
condition
marginality.
Condition of existence.
Absolutely. Need to throw up their collective energies. And the formula that you mentioned, educate, agitate and organize, although it was drawn from the larger
understanding of Buddha,
independent labor traditions of the Fabian movement, and John Dewey also repeats this formula when he forms his party, he eventually comes to attribute it to the Buddha. So it's quite interesting because Ambedkar thinks that the modern emancipatory project is a very different project compared to the past. Now, in this case, the state comes in. Now, the state for Ambedkar begins to be a rule-governed agency, but it is also an agency with democratic sanction. So, the state is a constitutional state for Ambedkar, but he thinks that constitutional state is a necessity for emancipatory struggles to explore themselves, as well as to contain people who are adversarial to these emancipatory movements. So he thinks that constitutional state would play a role of protecting the rights of people and providing them resources to actually carry on their struggles. Eventually he thought that democracy has to work out its own logic, but even democracy to work out its own logic, constitutional device is absolutely important.
Yes.
So there it is important. He thought that if the state does not come to the protection of the marginalized, excluded and the defiled, there is little resource for them to fight out their own battles.
In fact, Ambedkar wrote the annihilation of caste in the context of the nation in the making. So it was the text is written in the context of a larger political movement, and he emphasized that the making of the formation of a national community, transgressing the hierarchies of caste, gender or inequalities, and positing a kind of ethical moral principles. Could you reflect upon? Could you reflect upon the work of Ambedkar's one of the important, perhaps magnum opus work, that is Annihilation of Caste, and this context, and could you link it with the making of a national community, or the nation, the idea of nation or nationalism?
Yeah, I would personally read Annihilation of Caste with certain other texts of Ambedkar, particularly Thoughts on Pakistan, and they are closer. Yes. So let me actually reflect first on Annihilation of Caste. What is the central argument that Ambedkar builds up there? Ambedkar begins to say that so far there are two tendencies which dominate Indian national movement. One tendency begins to say, let's have political independence, and once political independence comes, we will take care of whatever social reforms have to be done.
Yeah.
There is the other tendency which begins to say that let us do social reforms, build bridges across the great social divide in India, and make ourselves worthy to become independent. Now, he critiques both these positions. He begins to say, all right, you are going to fight for your political independence without caring for social reforms, but whose independence is it going to be? Is it not going to be the domination of the few against the many? So far you have been dominating. Is it not going to be not merely going to reproduce that domination, but that domination is going to be reinforced by the newly acquired state power, an argument which Phule had made earlier in Gulamgiri and also in Shetkarache Asud.
Yes.
But Ambedkar asserts that argument with greater force. Against the social reformers, people like Ranade, Ambedkar would say, all right, you are talking about social reforms and bridging the great divide within India, but what kind of social reforms are you talking about? You are talking about widow remarriage, you are talking about age of consent, you are talking about abolition of sati, But all these social evils are pertaining only to caste Hindus. But none of you are talking about getting rid of caste, because the greatest social evil in India is caste, and only by getting rid of caste you can actually bring the nation together. Now there is also a subtle argument that he develops against Marx, against socialists, whom he calls socialists. And Ambedkar's usage of the word socialist was very inclusive. He begins to tell the socialists, you are talking about class and class struggle. But how are you going to bring class? Because as soon as you bring class together, it is going to fragment itself across the caste divide. So unless you begin to attend to caste and begin to talk about annihilating caste, how will the class actually come to gather itself together? So Ambedkar's now alternative, therefore, is if the nation has to come together, caste has to be annihilated. But then he pushes the argument forward. He begins to say caste cannot be annihilated very easily, because caste is not a matter of mere secular or social churning. A large number of people believe that behind caste lies religious sanction, and if they neglect caste duties or do violations against caste injunctions, then they would have done something religiously wrong. And he begins to argue that people are not prepared to perform a religious wrong just because there is going to be a secular gain. And therefore, the sanctity attached to caste has to be destroyed.
Yeah.
Now,
definitely.
sanctity is attached to caste by scriptures.
Scriptures and religious texts.
And religious texts. And therefore, the Shastras themselves will have to go. So, it's a pushing forward of a particular kind of an argument. Now, you can always ask the question, do all the Shastras say this? Or are there not alternative Shastras which do not actually endorse caste? And Ambedkar, say for example in Buddha and his Dhamma, goes through this particular exercise of discretely...
As an alternative tradition.
Exactly. And the alternative tradition again, he does not put it in terms of binaries.
Yeah, definitely.
He begins to say, for example, say Sankhya philosophy. This Kapila begin to talk about so many things which are, are acceptable to human reason. But then there are issues there which can actually go to transcendence. So Buddha is listening to Kapila. Buddha is very sensitive to Sankhya philosophy. So now the binary is expanded, and then he begins to talk about traditions which are receptible to a kind of radical secular alternative.
So lastly, I would like to bring your attention to the predicament of a nation state. Now we have a long, about 60 or 65, about 70 years of an experience as a democratic nation state. What are the problems from this point of view? What are the problems that our country is facing? Could you suggest, or as a politician or a political scientist, as a political scientist, what are the things that you to make sense of all these issues?
You are putting that question in general terms, but I would like to drag you a little to Baba Saheb Ambedkar, because he wrote so much on...
from that point of view.
Yeah, exactly. So he wrote so much on nationalism. And Ambedkar has a distinct theory of nationalism, which is very interesting. Because he does not think that nationalism, you can explain all facets of nationalism by reason. That he thinks that nationalism is a feeling of a kind which takes possession of people and makes them to feel kith and kin.
Kith and kin, a feeling of we feeling.
Yeah, a we feeling.
I mean, a sense of kith and kin.
Yeah, but you cannot actually always reduce this feeling into causal reasons. But then you can do something by which the spirit of nationalism can be made sensible to issues of reason. Now, he also did not think initially that nationalism is going to be a universal feeling, unlike somebody like Benedict Anderson. But once nationalism begins to take possession of a people, you cannot wish it away. And given in this background, I would like to respond quickly to the query that you have raised. Ambedkar thinks that a nation is a complex entity, that within a nation there could be several nationalities, and within a nation there could be several communities. But one has to be constantly aware that nationalities can convert themselves into nationalisms and can demand secession, and communities can think themselves as nationalities and even come to think themselves as independent nation states. So it depends upon a people and the democratic reasoning of that particular kind of a setting to see that communities are kept as communities rather than they graduating themselves into nationalities. For Ambedkar, therefore, there are immense possibilities that a democratic society opens up, wherein people begin to reach out to others and allow others to reach out to you, and your personality grows by reaching out to others. In a country like India, see, at least suppose we identify 3 or 4 big problems in India. One of the big problems that Indian nation faces today is how do you make sense of the great diversity in India? There are no easy parallels. Indian diversity is sui generis, and it has to be engaged on its own terms, and we have not come to engage with it. But Ambedkar gives a kind of a direction in which we can actually progress. We still have the big problems of reaching out in the sense of human concern and dignity to Dalits and particularly to Adivasis. We still do not know how the Adivasi world is going to live with a sense of dignity and belonging in the broader domain of the Indian society. We still have not sorted out our problems of social inequalities. There is still, age-old structures of patronage and clientelism. Often there is of course the process of affirmative action and reservation policies have made a significant difference to the lives of a segment of people who have been affected. But there is the vast majority there who have not been touched even by reservation. But even in the reserved categories, as Vemula's case demonstrates, constantly that tag that you belong to that particular group constantly haunts you, and you are not going to be treated as a human.
Or equal citizen.
Yeah. And see, after all, your sense of your own dignity emerges from my recognition, And if I am going to, in my heart of heart, I am going to think, oh, this fellow, he was a Dalit, and he has come to this stage because of reservation, which he doesn't deserve, then I am not going to treat you as equal. So for Ambedkar, equality becomes an inner virtue rather than an external mechanisms. So I have a feeling that we have not come to live as a kind of a nation which encompasses within it great deal of diversity and people of very, very different kinds of histories, of social inequalities. We have not responded to our own culture in significant ways. we think that there are certain texts to be, you know, hyped up, and we have ignored the other great texts. There is no sensitivity to the great folk traditions in India, and I don't think we have begun to treat our languages and our pluralisms very seriously.
We have shared a lot of ideas, important and ideas of contemporary relevant. So thank you for your.
Thank you, Dr. Madhavan.
Thank you.